Okay, thanks very much. And that's definitely going to be a hard act to follow, but I will do my best. And I noticed on the poll that one of the number one things that everybody wants to learn is how to interview better. So I hope to give you a couple of tips about a lot of the things I've learned over the years. So as a quick intro, as Jeff mentioned, I'm with Sterling Partners. We're a private equity firm here in Chicago. We've got $5 billion under management, and we focus specifically in investing in small to middle market, high growth businesses across the sectors of healthcare services, education, and business services. So my role, I've been with the firm now for 9.5 years, and as I mentioned, as Jeff mentioned, I came from Korn Ferry, and Jeff probably doesn't know, but he actually had an interesting impact on the evolution of my role at Sterling. So about 6 weeks in, I was hired as the head of talent. And at that time, Sterling was certainly on the forefront of bringing in somebody to run talent for the portfolio, meaning recruiting in some capacity. So there wasn't a ton of definition around what they wanted, but they knew that they were making some mistakes as it relates to hiring some of the management team, so they wanted to bring somebody in to fix that mistake. So about 6 weeks into the role, Jeff came into my office because he has such an interest in recruiting, and he said, "So what are you working on?" And me being new in the role, and I just moved to Chicago, wanted to be the hero, I said, "Gosh, there's so much interest," because I think what happened was somebody at Sterling emailed the portfolio and said, "We hired a recruiter, call her if you need anything." And so after 6 weeks, when Jeff asked, "What am I working on?" I looked down and I had about 60 different requests from across all of our portfolio companies. We had about 23 at the time. And it was anywhere from a CEO to a summer intern and everything in between. And he said to me, "How are you going to do that? That's impossible. There's no way." And in my mind, I thought, well, of course there's got to be a way I can figure this out. But the reality was there was not a way I could do it without resources. But what occurred to me, and where the light bulb kind of came on, was, wait, why is our portfolio reaching out to the fund for all of these different hires? Something must be off. And what I found out after digging and meeting with a lot of our CEOs was that HR had not been a function that they had placed a lot of importance on as it related to growing the companies. Unbelievable to me, because these were already successful businesses, and I thought, we invest in so many services businesses which are fueled by people. How is this possible that the HR function is not sitting alongside the CEO? So I spent my first 18 months meeting with all of our CEOs and educating them, for lack of a better word, about the benefit of having a very strong strategic head of HR, because historically they had had the personnel administrative clerk that we all know is history and way behind us, but that was an evolution. So today my role is focused on recruiting board directors, CEOs, CFOs, and heads of HR across our portfolio. And our philosophy is that if we get those roles right, our investment is going to be way off to the races, and we're going to be ahead of ourselves. So, with all of that to say, and I'm here to talk to you about how to get the most out of your interview, I'm going to cover 3 things today. Number 1, interviewing methodology. Number 2, preparing for the interview. And 3rd, conducting the interview. So let's get started. So many of you might be familiar with a firm called GH Smart. They do a lot of executive assessments. We engage them as well as some other firms to do a lot of the assessments on our CEOs and CFOs. Years ago, they did a study called The Art and Science of Human Capital Valuation. One of the areas of focus of this study was to identify best and worst practices in evaluating management teams of PE and VC-backed companies. Through this study, they identified 4 distinct interview methodologies that all of us fall into this category or have at some point in our career when we spend so much time interviewing. The first is the prosecutor. I hope some of you have been on the opposite side of this, and I hope none of you actually are the prosecutor in your interviews, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But basically, the prosecutor is this. It's the person that's firing tough questions. They're giving hypothetical questions and scenarios, and what they're trying to do is trip up the witness. It puts the candidate on the defensive right out of the gate. The second is the sponge. In the case of the sponge, this is someone that spends a ton of time with the candidate, a lot of dinners, golf outings, social events, tons and tons of interviews, because the interviewer believes the more time I spend, the better I'm going to be in being able to assess this candidate thoroughly. The third is the art critic. In this case, the interviewer is very reflective on every word that the candidate says, really taking into their kind of gut feeling about the overall candidate and their fit to the role, very subjective in their overall assessment. And then finally, the airline captain. In the case of the airline captain, they have a very, very rigorous approach, extremely data-driven, and they ask questions specifically based on that candidate's past performance. So what they found in applying any of these different methodologies, and what this graphic will show you, is that in the case of the private equity or venture capital firms that used the airline captain methodology, they achieved significantly higher IRR than when other methods were used. So the moral of the story here is that the airline captain is the way to go, but let's talk a little bit deeper about what that is, because as you can appreciate, for all of us in here that are in private equity and venture capital, either on the fund side or in those backed businesses, this is a really, really important thing for the overall success of your business. So let's dive deeper into this. I want to talk about how to prepare for the interview. So you haven't even walked in the door yet to meet with the candidate. What do you need? Number one, what are you looking for? That better be clear. You've got to have that position spec, better yet, a scorecard, and then make sure that the entire interviewing team is on the same page, because it can be a disaster if you walk out the door and everybody's got a different opinion of the person because we're not assessing against the same criteria. The second, I would say, review the resume. It seems pretty basic, but when you're doing volume interviews, sometimes you're just, what's next, who's next, you're walking in the door. The good part about doing this, and where you might get ahead, is that you can do a little research and of course leverage LinkedIn, leverage Facebook, leverage other social networks to see, do you have any common connections? Do you know the companies that they've been a part of in the past? And then therefore, when you're establishing rapport with the candidate, you can certainly make those connections early on. And then the third thing, and this is something that I'm a big fan of. So I love checklists, and I love being disciplined about various processes. There is a great book that was written by Atul Gawande called The Checklist Manifesto. The book itself was written on the premise that airline captains, after flying thousands of flights over their lifetime, they are not taking off a flight without going through a very disciplined checklist. And he thought, well, what if that was applied to other processes, whether it's in business, whether it's in healthcare? And so he did many, many studies, and this is a book we actually give to all of our new board members and CEOs as well, because there's so many lessons in it. But just to give you a quick example, so they did a study at Johns Hopkins. They were having problems with a lot of infections that were being that the patients were getting in the hospital when they would go in for other treatments. And so they said, we have to reduce this. This is costing us a ton of money. We're having, in the worst case, patients are dying because of infections they're getting here. So what can we do? So they put together a very simple checklist. And when I say simple, we're talking the doctors will wash their hands. The doctors must wash their hands. Check. They need to clean the patient's skin. They need to drape the patient completely. The doctor needs to wear a mask, hat, gloves, and a gown, and then they need to have a sterile dressing over the insertion site. After 1 year, the 10-day infection rate for central lines dropped from 11% to 0, and during the 27-month study, the checklist prevented 43 infections and 8 deaths and saved over $2 million for that specific hospital. And that was following what I'd consider a pretty basic checklist in a hospital. But again, when you forget the very basic things, that's a little bit more challenging. So what does this have to do with interviewing? I say have a checklist before you walk in the door. A checklist not specific to that candidate, but more, what are you trying to get out of that interview? What do you want to tell them about your company and about the role? What questions specifically do you need to ask to learn if they have that specific experience? So I say have a checklist before you walk in the door. So next we're going to talk about conducting the interview. So when you sit down with the candidate, you've got the setup. Fairly basic, start on time, end on time. This is respectful to not only the candidate, but to all of your colleagues that are following behind you. Second, be friendly. Be engaging with the candidate. This is something that I think is lost on a lot of people because you feel like in the interview position you need to be stoic and stern and this, that, and the other. There's a way to do it by being friendly and engaging, and what that does in my experience is it sets the candidate at ease And what's interesting about it is, from a secret weapon standpoint, I have found people will tell you a lot, and sometimes too much. You don't want to hear some of the stories, but the reality is when the candidate is at ease, they're in a better position to show you who they really are versus being the stiff, nervous, uber buttoned up candidate. You want to see who this person is at the core. Third, of course, describe the process to the candidate, tell them what you're hoping to accomplish at that time, and then make sure that they know that there will be time at the end for their questions. So as you're controlling the interview, make sure that you do reserve that time, but that you wait until the end for them to ask their questions. So from an interview standpoint, as we all know, there are varying degrees and varying styles of interviewing. But when it comes to talking about a process and how to get the most out of your time, I'm just going to go over what I think is a good framework for a general screening interview that lasts about 45 to 60 minutes. Sometimes we'll do extremely deep dive interviews that are 2 or 3 hours, and there's a different structure for that. But for the purposes of today, let's talk about conducting the interview and what that framework will look like. Basic introduction, no more than 3 minutes. This is your opportunity to set the candidate at ease, engage with them, establish a certain rapport. The second is ask them about their career goals. I enjoy this part of the conversation almost the most because you ask a lot of open-ended questions about what motivates them, what makes them tick. A question that I ask, and Kira mentioned this earlier, that she asked this of the employees at her company, but I always ask every single candidate, what's important to you? And again, they could be telling you something that's important to them in their personal life, in their professional life, but regardless, you're getting a little bit more insight into how they think and what truly is important to them. And when you're trying to evaluate cultural fit, that's usually a key piece. The bulk of the interview is going to be spent, of course, on prior experiences. We all know this. You're going to go through the companies that they've been with and the accomplishments that they've had. I would also encourage you to go a little bit deeper and ask who their bosses were at each individual company and the role that they were in, and then ask what their boss would say about them. This is what they call the kind of the implied threat of reference check, because somebody might be a little bit more balanced in their answer versus in full interview, I'm selling myself, because if they think, you might actually call my boss, so I should probably be a little more balanced in my approach there. Again, it's another way to just get a little bit behind the scenes as far as learning about the candidate in a short, condensed period of time. Finally, as you promised, candidate questions. Make sure you give them that opportunity. They may not have questions, and maybe that's okay, but you've got to give them that time. And then finally, the process and next steps. And then I would say before you walk out the door, refer to your checklist to make sure you covered everything. And especially on a long day of interviewing, you need to make sure that you have all of your bases covered so that you can come back and give a full recommendation on all the candidates that you've met. So in summary, we all have our own style, and you've got to have your own style. There's no way you can copy what anybody else does. You've got to be comfortable. You've got to make the candidate comfortable. So I'm going to leave you with a few things. Number one, be the airline captain. Dig a little bit deeper into that. Be more rigorous and data-driven in your interview process. Number two, be curious. Ask the next question. Ask them about things that might not be on the resume or the special interests at the bottom. Dig into that and try to establish that rapport and show that you're curious about digging into their background. As hard as it might be, reserve judgment while you're in your interview until you leave. And I would also say, don't tip your hand in the interview. Don't act overly impressed or the opposite, extremely underwhelmed with anything that they're telling you. Reserve judgment and keep a friendly but poker face throughout the interview, because that's going to allow for the momentum to sustain throughout. And this one, I cannot live without. Take copious notes. Yesterday, I spent the day interviewing 5 different CFOs. There's no way I could have remembered every nuance had I not taken the amount of notes that I did and then debriefed on the plane afterwards, and then was able to provide my assessment to my partners. And then finally, and most important, none of this matters at all if you don't do deep reference checking. And I know somebody else is going to talk about that, but you have to validate what you learned. People can be great interviewers, you can be a great interviewer, but you still have to validate what you heard and ensure that it's the right fit for you guys. So I would tell everybody, do the work on the front end. It will pay off tenfold when you make better hires and ultimately get better results for your company. So thank you very much. Oh.